1-4 Complex Numbers, Day 1. The learning goal is that you will be able to represent complex numbers and their operations on a complex plane. In this section, we're going to study expressions whose solutions may involve the square roots of negative numbers. Because the square of a real number is never negative, there is no real number that solves the equation x squared equals -1. So mathematicians have invented an expanding system of number called complex numbers. And the imaginary number I is defined to be a solution of x squared equals -1. So when you see I equals the square root of -1, which means, and you need to remember this, that if you square both sides, I squared equals -1. And you need to mark that because we're going to use this later. So if you have the square root of -25, then basically what this means is the square root of -1 times the square root of 25, where the square root of -1 is I, and then since the square root of 25 is a perfect square, your solution would be 5I. And if you had to check your solution, if you square 5I, you would square the 5, which is 25, and then you would square the I, which is I squared, but we already said I squared equals -1, so this equals -25. Now, a complex number is in this form: A plus BI. And this is called standard form when you have the real number first, and the B and the I, that's the imaginary unit. So if they ever ask you to write it in standard form, this is what they mean. So standard form, the real number is first, the imaginary unit is second. So looking at example 1, we're going to learn how to add and subtract complex numbers, and we're going to write the answer in standard form. So what you're going to do is you're going to add the real numbers, so -2 and 4, that would be 2, and then you're going to add the imaginary unit, 6I plus -I is 5I, and then you're done. Now with subtraction, you just have to make sure that you be careful of these negatives. So I'm going to distribute that negative. So it's going to be 7 plus 9 minus 2I. And I'm going to distribute this negative, plus 17 plus I. And then you do the same thing. You add all your real numbers. 7 plus 9 is 16, plus 17 is 33. And then you add all your imaginary numbers. negative 2i, and positive 1i is negative I. Example 2 is multiplying. And when you multiply, you're going to notice that you're going to end up with the I squared. And don't forget, every time you see I squared, that equals negative 1. Alright, so for A, we're just going to distribute. Negative 8i times 2i is negative 16i squared. Negative 8i times negative 7 is positive 56i. Well, remember I squared is negative 1. So that gives me positive 16 plus 56i. And remember, standard form, the real number comes first. For B, I'm just going to FOIL. I'm going to do first, outer, inner, and then last. If you notice, the middle terms cancel out. They won't do that every time, but in this case it did. So I have 4 minus, there's that I squared. So I'm going to change it to negative 1. And that gives me 4 plus 49, which gives me 53. And then for C, this means that we have to write it twice. 5 minus 2i times 5 minus 2i. I'm going to FOIL again. First, outer, inner, and last. Now in this case, my middle terms don't cancel. So I have 25 minus 20i plus 4, oh, there's that I squared. So I have 25 minus 4, which is 21, minus 20i. The last example is dividing complex numbers. And when you are dividing, what's happening is you have this I in the denominator. And remember, I represents the square root of a negative. And you can't have a square root in the denominator. So what we do is we multiply by the conjugate. Okay, so we're going to FOIL on the top. You're going to have first, outer, inner, and then last. On the bottom, you're going to FOIL. You're going to have first, outer, inner, and then last. And what should happen in the denominator, your two middle terms should cancel out. If they don't, that means you didn't multiply by the conjugate, or either you did something wrong. Okay, so in my denominator, I'm going to have 16 minus 9. Oh, there's that I squared, so I'm going to change it to negative 1. And then the top, I'm going to have 16, negative 9, and minus 16i, negative 9i minus 16i is negative 25i plus 12, and there's that I squared. Okay, so in my numerator, I'm just going to write it down here. I'm going to have 16 minus 25i minus 12. And then in my denominator, I'm going to have 16 plus 9. So that's going to leave us with 16 minus 12, which is 4, minus 25i over 25. Now, when you're dividing and they ask you to write it in standard form, you have to split up the fraction. So it's going to be 4 over 25 minus 25 over 25i. And then you can reduce when you can. And if not, you leave it alone. So this is standard form. And we are done.